What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again, and this time we are here with Richard West of the almighty Threshold. Great to be able to talk with you, man. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, anytime, man. Anytime. It's so great to have you here. The new album, Dividing Lines, is absolutely beautiful. I think it is the perfect follow up to Legends of the Shires from 2017. For people who haven't heard the album yet, though, do you feel that King of Nothing and Silence, the first two singles that you released, is a good representation of what Dividing Lines is going to sound like? Or being that Threshold has always brought in many different elements, there's a lot more to be discovered?
The honest answer is you probably know better than me. We wrote the songs back in 2020, and then we recorded them in 21 when we could get back in the studio, and then we put them out. They'll be out at the end of 22. So for us, they've been around so long, it's really hard to see them with fresh eyes. So you tell me, are they a good representation?
Well,
What you heard came out?
I don't think one Threshold song could define the sound of Threshold because you guys bring in so many different elements together. I think the beautiful thing about Threshold is that you never know what to expect.
That's a good answer. So I'd probably say then we should have released one of the long ones like Defense Condition, because that's got more room for more elements in there. But you can't put out 10-minute singles as a general rule. It's not the best way to catch people's attention.
Yeah, it's Prague, right? I mean, I think 10 minutes is short by those standards.
True.
Yep. Did you conceptually, in a way, consider Dividing Lines to just be a continuation of Legend of the Shires, or was this meant to kind of be like a new beginning for Threshold in a way?
No, well, obviously same lineup, which is no small feat for us. We're quite good at the lineup changes over the years, so to have the same lineup's always nice. Actually, for a while we were going to call it The Fall of the Shires, make it a full-on sequel, and some of the songs are kind of written with that in mind. But I think after a while the guys just thought, well, maybe that's a bit contrived, so we separated it from that, and it's become more of an album of cautionary tales, I guess, rather than a full-on concept album.
And
I think during the writing process we kind of weaved around. We changed our minds a few times, but we're very happy with what we've come up with.
Definitely. As a big fan of Threshold, if you played me 30 seconds of a song, I'd be able to tell that that's off of Wounded Land, or that's off of Clone, that's off of Hypothetical, etc. So is it fair to say that, like, Threshold has do you guys always maybe start off with a preconceived idea of what you want a Threshold album to sound like, or is there a lot of improvising and a lot of experimentation in your songwriting process?
Well, that's a good question, which is what people always say when they can't quite think of the answer, isn't it? I've been watching so many podcasts recently, and you see people saying all the time, great question, and they're looking panicky. So here's me being panicky. I think, honestly, we normally leave a bit of time between albums. I think by then we've worked on other things, we've listened to other things. And so you kind of come back to the Threshold idea with a fresh head, really, fresh set of ideas. So it's not that we'll sit down and say, hey, we're going to make an album that sounds like X, Y, and Z. You just come back and say, well, let's make another Threshold album, but I've got all these new ideas that I've been picking up along the way. And that tends to be how it all comes together. You look at some bands and you think, well, they specifically try and change style with each record, and we've never really thought of doing that. As nice it would be to say, hey, let's make a Pink Floyd album, or let's make a Yes album. I think we just say, let's make a Threshold album, and we see what happens.
And I'd imagine too that makes it a little bit easier to try new things within your sound as well, right? Because like it feels like that there is no limit, so you're not sort of like confined to a specific. Like I think a Threshold, while you do have a sound that I think defines you, I think Threshold avoids the hazard of a Threshold song sounding too much like a Threshold song.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah,
I think that's probably why. It's just because we keep coming back with fresh influences. And it's hard to say. There isn't a specific song that says, well, that's what Threshold is. So we always come back at it and think, well, we've got to have a bit of prog, we've got to have a bit of heavy, we've got to have some catchy choruses, we've got to have some solos. And you just put them all in the mixing pot and see what comes out. And it's going to be different every time.
And being that Threshold is also conceptually driven and does think of concept albums plenty of times, does sometimes the concept you think of, the band thinks of, maybe dictate the direction of the sound as well? Or is it always needed, has there always been music needed before you guys can really think of a meaning?
Yeah, all about the good questions today, aren't you? I would say for Legends, so we wrote a few songs and I wrote a few lyrics, and it started to feel like we had a story on the way. So at that point, me and Carl had a chat, and we were quite specific. Yeah, it looks like we got a concept album. Here's the concept. Wrote down what the story was, and then we started writing towards that goal. But I have to say that's fairly unique for us. We normally just write the songs and see what happens. So we haven't done that many actual concept albums over the years. Mm-hmm. And then going back, I mean, Clone from back in '98 was a concept album. But that was, I think, John Geary was a bass player then. He wrote the lyrics for quite a lot of the songs, and he had a very clear idea what he wanted. He told me, and I kind of had a clear idea of how I thought it should be, and I kind of probably wrote stuff that didn't necessarily help the concept. So it's difficult when you've got a team of creative people that have got necessarily different ideas. Yeah. I think especially when we were younger, maybe we were pulling in different directions. But certainly since the last few albums, it's really I've been the main lyricist, so I've not had any of those obstacles. Not calling John an obstacle, but it kind of makes it easier because you can kind of have an idea and just go for it.
Yeah, I thought Legends of the Shires was almost kind of like a sister album of Psychedelic Assassin because of the return of the lineup in a way. Like, did that maybe also influence that sound as well and the sort of story ideas? Is that how you sort of got the story of unfolding? I've always thought that the song Stars and Satellites is really representative of unity and sort of like a return to form in a way, which is sort of why I asked that.
I bet you see more in it than we do. That's fantastic. Mm-hmm. For me, it's like Psychedelic Assassin because it's got Glyn on it again. So obviously you got that return. But most of the album was written thinking it was going to be for Damien, so it wasn't really written with that in mind. But later on, songs, I think, if I remember rightly, I think Superior Machine, which we wrote really late on, I think at that point we knew we had Glyn, or we knew we probably had Glyn, and that was very much written with him in mind. And you could kind of hear that old school Threshold sound. I think when Carl wrote the riffs and when I wrote the melodies, you could kind of hear that old Psychedelic Assassin sound going on. And that was really fun to do, actually. It's just really nice little nod back to the past.
And when you explore concepts or stories, is it always like an external source of inspiration, or is it like an internal? Does it represent like an internal experience in a way, or does Threshold kind of use music as a means to explore outside of oneself?
I think I'd probably give Subsurface as an example for that. So it's kind of a concept album in that it takes a lot of elements of kind of fictional politics like 1984, which have kind of got a ring of truth to them, by George Orwell, but they've got a fictional element, and then throw in a few philosophical ideas just to make it kind of a thinking man's album, and then throw in a few personal experiences and observations as well, and you put them all in that mixing pot and see what comes out. So you kind of get a bit of truth, bit of current now, a bit of fiction, bit of fantasy. It's a strange mix, but it seems to be what keeps coming back on quite a few of our albums.
And do you feel that if you, because when Threshold plays live, you have to bring songs from almost every album or try to. Do you feel that maybe when you play songs in a set list and mix the songs up a little bit, that almost kind of brings a new layer of context to the songs as well?
It's what we find. I mean, there's two elements I think for doing that. Obviously, with 12 albums, it's really, really hard to pick a set list that's going to satisfy everybody. What we found, I think, you look back at the two early Damien Wilson albums, Wounded Land and Extinct Instinct, it's harder to sit them in the set. They're written in a different way. I'd say they're just slightly off the Threshold canon in terms of their writing. So it's when you're bringing in old songs, it's trying to make them flow in the set list where you still feel like you're the same band. And then another issue we had on Legends on the tour was quite a lot of the songs with Damien, and they just sound really high because Damien's got a higher range of voice than Glyn. So we find there's quite a few songs, actually, if we put them in the set, Glyn's just going to lose his voice because he's going to be straining so hard to hit those notes. So there's a few practical aspects as well. Yeah. And we've never gone the route of tuning the key of a song down yet. I don't know if in 20 years maybe we'll be doing that. It'll be down half an octave so you can reach the notes. I've seen, bands like Europe, if you listen to Europe playing Final Countdown live, it's very much a different key to what it was back then because there's no way he can sing up there anymore. And it's a great way of doing it, but we haven't quite gone that route yet.
One of my favorite stories is when I was doing an interview with I Hate God, and Mike Nine told me that they opened with that song and they ended with it. So... now, as a keyboardist, I've always said that piano and keys are the most emotional instrument in the world because of the notes that are incorporated in there and the different vibes it could get. When we hear the keyboards in Threshold, is that representative of a particular emotion that you were feeling in a way, or is it from observing the music feeling like this progression is the best to incorporate in there?
So progressions, I don't know. I mean, you listen to pop music; they all use the same chords, don't they? If you even get a chord sequence these days. And I've always been of the impression that you should write your own chord sequences. You shouldn't copy anybody else's. So I always try and come up with something that I've not heard before, and I try and come up with something that I find beautiful. And that's my two criteria, really. Yeah, it's got to be original. It's got to be beautiful. And so when I write something like "Palette in the Sky of Dreams," you listen to those chords, you think, well, I never heard those anywhere in the world. But hopefully you think, well, they're kind of nice too. And that's kind of my approach every time. But it's interesting because I think with keyboards, as you say, you can get a lot of beauty and emotion in just into a chord sequence like that. But when it comes to soloing, I just wish I was a guitarist or a saxophonist or something, because they're the guys who really get to put the passion into a solo. It's so hard on the keyboard to convey the same emotion you can put in on a guitar. So it's a constant battle to try and somehow put emotion into that.
Do you find it easier to come up with ideas when you're, because isolation is such a great fuel for creativity? Do you find it easier to come up with ideas when you're more alone in your own element, or is it maybe easier to come up when you're in the company of your bandmates?
Oh, we never write together. That's a terrible thing to say, but no, I can't remember ever writing a song. Maybe Wounded Lamb was written that way. I wasn't around back then. But no, we're all individual composers. So I sit in here and I write, and when I finish the demo, I'll send it off to the guys. And by then, it's got everything on the drums, bass, guitars, keyboards, vocals, harmonies, the whole lot. It's kind of a finished song. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of weird if you listen to the first two singles. So Silenced was written just in here like that, complete song. And then the second one, King of Nothing, written by Glyn. He did the same, back up at his own home studio, put the song together, put the whole thing on there. So you're kind of listening to individual solo tracks in a way. But then the band get their hands on them and make it sound like Threshold.
Definitely. And circling back to the conceptual elements of Threshold, do you feel, because I've always said that art is life, and when you bring it into the world, it grows and develops and attracts new meaning and new people attracting themselves to it. Do you feel that maybe the concept of an album can also evolve over time for Threshold, or do you prefer if every album is more or less a snapshot or a representation of who you and everybody in that band were at that time?
No, definitely the first one. I think that whenever I write, certainly with lyrics, I try not to be too specific. You don't want to write about a subject with the title that's the subject and a nice summary of the subject. You want to keep it artistic. You want to leave it open for people to bring their own interpretation to it. I think that's where the beauty of songs comes from. That when you hear a song, it becomes your song and you hear it your way. And if you're too prescriptive about it, you write about a person and put their name in it, it suddenly, you can't identify with the song in the same way.
Definitely.
So I've always tried to keep things universal that way.
I've always said that people's interpretations of a songs are almost like fingerprints. Everybody has their own distinct way of interpreting it.
Yeah, and I think if you tend to kind of cover universal sort of themes, but coming from your heart based on what you see around you and what you're reading, you put your stamp on it as a writer, put their stamp on it.
Yeah, 100%. And here comes the most difficult question of the interview. Are you ready?
Go on then, another one.
How do you know when a song is done?
I'm ready for this. Sorry, I think we were glitching then. Yeah, go on. Difficult question, I'm ready.
How do you know when a song is done?
Wow, when I was younger, really, really hard. Now I'm older, they're just done. There's no issues. I think some people maybe aren't finished and others are, and I think maybe the longer you've been writing, it's easier to finish. But for me, it's just obvious. If you finish and it's done, move on to the next one. That said, it probably takes a good 6 months.
Yeah.
Well, before it sounds like I churn out a song a day. I'll carry the riffs around in my head for weeks. The lyrics, they'll be kind of going around fine-tuning, changing little melodies here and there. Then you get onto the computer, start putting stuff into Pro Tools, start tweaking things about a bit. So it can take a very long time. But yeah, I always know when it's done. So
yeah.
I'm never thinking, I have to go back and fix something.
I'd imagine by 12 albums by now, it's almost instinctual.
Yeah, I hope so. What I always find is when you start writing for a new album, especially if it's been a couple of years since the last one, you're just getting into the flow of it. You've written 3, 4, 5 songs, and then the other guys have written a few as well. You think, oh, we finished. But I'm ready. I could write another 5, and then you wait another 2 years before you write the next 5. So it's kind of a weird process. You kind of feel like, yeah, ready to go now. Oh, we're finished.
Yeah. Do you find it maybe the longer you work on a song or an album, even the harder it is to kind of like maintain that emotional spark or energy that initially created that idea?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, as a writer, the real spark is in the writing. So by the time I finished that demo and delivered it to the guys, it's kind of done. And it's like, that's the creative spark for me over. And after that, it's more process. There's a lot of inspiration in the process because the guys will bring their own influences to it and bring their own ideas. And it makes you think, wow, that sounds amazing. But the actual creative spark, yeah, that's over by the demo. So having written all these songs by the end of 2020, I think most of them anyway, then a whole year of just on-off recording them, yeah, by the end it's just process.
Definitely.
Don't want to burst your bubble, but it takes work to make a record. But when you get to the end and you hear the final mixes, even the mixing actually, because when you're hearing them, all you're hearing are the problems because you're there to fix the problems. It's like that level's too high, that bit's slightly off, whatever. So you're never listening to it with pleasure. You're just constantly listening for problems. And once you then deliver the final mixes to the record company, it's a few weeks before you can go back and listen as a listener, rather than listening for problems. And it's kind of a mental switch you have to go through.
Yeah, and when you're only looking for problems, you just assume the worst with every song, and all the pride that you had with writing it kind of goes out.
Oh yeah, you can have a 10-minute song and it's got a 3-second section that's not working and it's like the worst song in the world. And then finally you fix those 3 seconds and it's the best song in the world.
Definitely. Now there's
the pain of a writer, really.
You know what? It's the pain of all artists, right? And but it's that pain that keeps us going, in a way. And there's a couple of anniversary-related questions I wanted to ask because next year is going to be 30 years of Wounded Land, the debut of Threshold. I'll ask this right now. Can we be expecting maybe any type of celebration in that regard? Because I consider Threshold to be one of the big four, in my opinion, of prog music with Porcupine Tree and Dream Theater and so many other great bands. So I would love to see a celebration of Wounded Land.
I appreciate that. Honest answer is we haven't talked about it yet. Obviously, we'll be out touring next year, but we haven't talked about what that's going to look like. Difficult because we don't have Damien anymore. We will seem to come to the big anniversaries just when we've got the wrong singer to celebrate them. So it's always a hard one to do. And I think with 12 albums, we've missed so many anniversaries already. We went through the 20ths and some 25s, and you think, oh no, we missed that one as well. So the honest answer is we're really bad at organising that sort of thing. But thank you for the reminder. I shall make a note and I'll have a chat with the guys, see what we want to do.
Yeah, but this year is also last year was 20 years of Hypothetical, and this year is 20 years of Critical Mass, and as I mentioned, 30 years of Wounded Land next year. But how would you say this, as you as an artist, you've evolved technically and emotionally in your songwriting? How has the evolution sort of changed over the years?
Probably just more surety, I think. When you're younger, you're trying stuff out, aren't you? You just need to listen to the Genesis back catalogue and you see them kind of growing and maturing as they go. There's stuff we'd never think of doing now. It's completely bonkers. But I think as you go on, you just get a bit more professional and focused in the way that you do stuff. But I hope it hasn't changed too much. I know even when I was writing songs like Silenced and Haunted on the new album, I just tried to put my mindset back to the early 2000s, so Hypothetical, Critical Mass sort of era, and imagine I was there and still influenced by the same things I was influenced by then, and tried to write with that hat on, and it was quite fun to do.
Are your songs
So I hope we haven't got all old and jaded and kind of formulaic.
Well, have you felt like maybe when you play like an older song and stuff, it is almost kind of like a time machine in a way, where you kind of like it does trigger the senses of sight and sound and even smell or taste of that time period?
Oh, massively. Yeah, if we do something from Wounded Land, I'm straight back in the rehearsal room in the 90s when I first walked in there and they were all playing, and it was like the most monstrous sound I ever heard. I think I walked in because it was my first rehearsal. They'd already been playing together for a while, and they were playing, I think, the opening riff from Consume to Live, and I'd never really heard them play. And the two guys on guitars with their amps turned up to 10, bass turned up, big empty hall just echoing out. When I walked in, it was just like walking through this huge wall. It was so impressive that I can still feel it and hear it today. So I go back there every time I hear that song.
Yeah, it's amazing how like a song, whether you wrote it or a song that you listened to back in the day, just puts us back in time. I've always said that albums really are like relics of time. They are like, I think that is the closest we get to going to time travel, going back in time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that and smell always surprises me.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You can
But
go straight back to being 6 years old with smell, can't you? You can be straight back in your mum's kitchen, and it's weird how that works. A smell you haven't smelt for like 30 years or something.
yeah, but smells, I feel like they're more similar. Like I think there are certain things, that foods that have a same smell, or certain elements that always have a same smell, but there's nothing that sounds like a specific Threshold album. There's nothing that sounds like Wounded Land or Legends of the Shires or Critical Mass or anything like that. So I feel like that is more of a time warp, because there was nothing that was ever written like that before, or that's going to be written after.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, do you find you're more listening to new songs, or do you still have that whole nostalgia thing where you just love to go back and listen to the old stuff?
I actually, for me, I'm always listening to new stuff. That's part of my job too. But like, so I usually have it divided in a week. Like I have like usually Monday and Tuesday. That's the beginning of a new week. So I put on new music, and then, I go back in time and listen to. I'm kind of a setting listener. I listen to specific music in certain settings. So
Cool.
yeah. And with all the sounds that is incorporated in Threshold, can that almost be also representative of different of the members of Threshold themselves? Is it like almost representative of a personality or an emotion, or even just an idea? Like, is it almost kind of like in a way of representing different feelings, I should say?
What, from the sounds?
Yeah.
That's another great question there. It's hard, isn't it? Because with Threshold, obviously the bass is pretty much the bass, the drums are pretty much the drums. The guitars, although Carl will come up with some interesting sounds and ideas, you kind of got that basic heavy riff sound that will evolve over time, and you can kind of date a Threshold album by maybe how the guitars sound a little bit. So for me, the big flavours are obviously what I do on the keyboards, and that's really just down to what I love the sound of at the time. And I think over the years, we've just had more access to more sounds and better synths, and you kind of start collecting all your favourite sounds as you go along. And so when it came to doing Dividing Lines, it was really easy. I knew just how I wanted it to sound. Probably when you're younger too, you try and put too much in, and it's a big thick layer of, oh, I've got 12 keyboards on this song, and I think I try to avoid that a little bit now, because I know we're supposed to be a guitar band to quite a strong degree. So I try and use it a bit more sparsely.
I don't think
I forgot your question, but I'm sure that was a good answer.
It was a great answer. It answered it perfectly, but it's funny too. I don't consider Threshold to just be a guitar band, because I think that there's parts where the vocals really stand out. Then there's parts where the keys really stand out. I find myself listening to a different Threshold song to hear a different sound, or for a different reason altogether.
Interesting. I will have to go and do the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, we do, even though we've kind of kept the same sort of palette, I suppose, as we've gone along, you do hear a change with every record. I mean, production styles change, writing styles change, the sounds that we can use come and go. So you're going to get specific eras without even meaning to, I think, as you go along. It's a snapshot of that year, isn't it?
Yeah. And we as humans all grow and develop. I'd imagine that maybe even subconsciously changes come within the band, just because we're different people than we were than when Wounded Lands first came out.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think I go back to albums like Extinct Instinct, where we just went completely mad and did some crazy stuff on there. And it's just because we were young, egotistical lads just wanting to stretch our boundaries and find out where they were. Whereas I think now we're just a bit more comfortable, so we'll just write stuff that we find beautiful. We're not too worried about trying to go out there and go crazy again.
Fair enough. I have two more questions for you. But when it comes to a Threshold live show, I have yet to see Threshold live, and I hope that changes very soon. But when it comes to playing live, is there at all any similarity in the energy channeled into your live presence as you do when you're songwriting, or do you consider playing live and songwriting almost two completely separate arts?
Yeah, totally different arts. I mean, keyboard player yourself, so I mean, you've probably experienced it. But what I love about getting up on stage and playing live is just playing loud and in sync with the other guys, And it's something, when you're in a studio, you're generally tracking, you're not all playing together. And it's very much a technical process. When you get on stage, you're playing together, you're listening to each other. You look at Jan and Steve on bass and drums, and they're just, eyes are locked to each other. They've got all these extra syncopated bits that they do together. It's like this dance that they're doing all the way through, and you don't get that in the studio to the same degree. And I think with those two especially, it develops over time. They'll come up with more and more ideas. So you listen to a song 20 years later and they're playing it totally different from how they did back at the beginning, because all these little weaves and dances have been worked into it. I think that's the beauty of live music, is just that interaction.
Definitely. But I wanted to ask you, because, when you are playing live, you are just taking the songs that we heard on albums and you are just replicating it in a live setting. So is there anything remotely creative about playing live if it is a very replicatory element?
I would say for those two, yeah, because they're probably the ones that can stretch it the most. A guitarist is going to be a guitarist, so Carl's going to be kind of locked into that. Keyboards, I'm playing certain chords, certain sounds, and that's kind of what we want to hear. Is you wanted to hear what was on the record when you go and see a band play live, don't you? Well, that's what I want to hear anyway. I want to be taken back to that era. So you don't want to suddenly come up with a wild, radical arrangement. So there's not so much creative, but just the art of playing is a creative element all on its own. When you're playing a solo, even if you're playing the same notes, there's so many ways to play them, trying to find the way to get that emotion into them. If you're playing a piano part, you're not going to play note for note every time. You're going to kind of move around and find different ways to move around those chords to make it sit with what the guys are doing. So it's kind of got creative elements, but it's not the same as writing. It's just subtleties.
Yeah, absolutely. And because you almost have to be creative too, because sometimes you're playing in a different type of room. It almost seems like you have to adjust to the atmosphere as well.
Yeah, and certainly if you can't hear each other, that makes it quite difficult. Back in the day, we used to quite often, don't know, if you just had dinner or something, you'd be playing 20% faster than you would be on another night. And when you're playing songs that are at the stretch of your ability, then you suddenly realise you got to play a solo that you can't normally play on the best of days, and suddenly it's 20% faster. That's quite tricky, and that gets quite creative. But fortunately now we play to a click track, so it's a bit easier. We know it's going to be the same speed every night.
Fair enough. That definitely does help. And the final question I wanted to ask you is, I sort of asked it a little bit before, if different sounds are representative of different emotions and whatnot. But for you as a keyboardist, it's kind of more on a technical level. Do you sometimes have to adjust your method of playing? Are you playing more chords or more single notes? Are you adjusting the key depending on what the vocals are doing, or the level of heaviness in the guitar, or the alternate rhythm in the drums in a way? Do you find that maybe you almost have to adjust your technical elements when you're playing?
Yeah, to a degree, and I think the key is an interesting one. One of the songs, I don't remember which one it was now. One of the songs on the album, Subliminal Freeways on Legends of the Shires, was actually written in a higher key. And then when Glyn came in to sing it instead of Damien, we put it down a key. And then we found it just didn't work anymore. The riffs were in the wrong place, the chord inversions were in the wrong place. It worked great for Glyn's vocals, but we had to change everything else. So yeah, there's definitely an interplay between everything. You have to adjust to what you're hearing. If you take a whole song down a key, you think, well, that's still going to work because you've all gone down. But suddenly it just all gets dirgy and thick, and you've lost all that openness and space.
Yeah.
So yeah, always having to adjust things around just to get that balance across the spectrum.
I think it's an extra level of difficulty for Threshold too, because all of the members have different. They work so well when they stand out, and you also work very well when you're together. So it's almost kind of like pun not intended, but almost like a dividing line of when can you all stand out and when do you all go together.
Yeah, that's true enough. Yeah, you've been saving that one up, haven't you?
Yeah, no, I've not. I swear, I just thought of that on the spot. So before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time today. For real, it was a pleasure talking to you, and I've wanted Threshold on this channel for a very long time, so it's great to finally have this on the list. Is there just anything else with Dividing Lines that you would like to promote for the new cycle? Is there a chance you could come back to the States one day? We would love to have you guys here.
Yeah, we're really hoping to. We're just, our agent's looking at things as we speak. So I imagine we'll be doing a European tour first, and then hopefully we'll conquer the world. So hopefully we'll come somewhere near you.
Oh, please. We'd love to have you, but thank you so much. Everybody, we are here with Richard West of Threshold, Dividing Lines. Be sure to pick that up. We will see you next time on Heavy New York.